Hi, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Malice in the Mitten. I am your host, Tracy Preston, along with my bestie, Christine Mulligan. Hey, Christine.
Hey, Trace. Hey, everybody. So today we're going to talk about the second part, John Norman Collins. So just to give everybody like a quick little recap, because, I'm sure people are starting to know how my brain kind of likes to synopsis and look at the other side of things. So when he was a kid, lived an abusive kind of life. Tracy, you always like to start these stories where you like to paint all of the bad stuff, so we might sort of maybe feel bad for him or commiserate with him or whatever, because he had a rough childhood. His mom was, not the best. Not that I ever like to say moms are no good, but sometimes, you have some. So his biological father was not really in his life because the mom left him because supposedly he was abusive, even though there wasn't any cooperation with that. But he was abusive. Then the mom jumps around from guy to guy to guy, kind of, throughout his life. And one eventually becomes their stepfather, a.k.a. who's the man they know as dad. And he is actually really abusive and does a few things to torment and, damage John. And then from there, he lives a normal life on the outside from what people could see, right? He's a star athlete. He's a good-looking kid. He even has girlfriends that say he was nice, but he had a hairpin trigger. So the smallest thing could set him off. But other than that, they really didn't think he was a murderer. You know what I mean? They didn't think he was an animal in any way. But he goes on through college, because college is when we start to know or start to learn about things that he's done, because Lord knows what he did as a kid. I mean, he lived in an abusive house and probably was on his own a lot. I mean, he was born in Canada, but lived in Michigan, right? He was raised in Michigan?
Yes,
Trace?
correct. They came to Michigan when he was 4.
So it was the late 50s, early 60s in Michigan. It was a time where young boys probably went out in the woods a lot, and Lord knows what he did, because this guy is definitely a small animal killer as far as I'm concerned, because of what we learned he did. But we don't know about any of that. That's just in my imagination. I like to color it a little bit. So he goes on to college, and he's living life. Nobody's suspecting him of anything. But at that time, he's murdering women a lot. There were quite a few victims that we learned already. What was there, 6, Trace?
There were a total of 7, and the killings started in 1967 and went through 1969.
So over the course of those years, he murders 7 women. We learn that he's got some kind of disgust for menstruation. There's a couple of incidents and a few people talk about how he's even said to women how that was disgusting, that they were menstruating. But yet, during his murders, he seems to much appreciate blood coming from the vagina, because he does an awful lot of things to them to make that happen. We're not really sure, nobody speaks to it exactly, if he was a necrophiliac, but he revisited the bodies and moved them around. So whether it was about necrophilia or whether it was about some kind of weird fear of if he leaves it in one place, the bodies will be found. But he did go back to the bodies and move the bodies on several occasions, how they find him and what they do to him. Right? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. We are going to pick up with the investigation of the last victim, Karen Beanman. So this is where we're going to pick up today. So let's get into it. This is season 4, episode 15, John Norman Collins, part 2. And boy, am I going to be happy when we finish this, because this dude is just absolutely diabolical and awful. All right, so we're picking up with the investigation of Karen Beanman. Police returned to the wig shop that Karen was last seen in and spoke with Diane Ghosh, who was the owner. She recalled that Karen bought a $20 hairpiece that afternoon of July 23rd. Diana also recalled that a young man with short, side-parted dark hair, wearing a horizontal striped sweater, was sitting on a blue motorcycle outside of the shop. Diana also told detectives that while Karen was buying the hairpiece, she pointed out the window toward the handsome guy on the bike and said that she had made two foolish errors in her life. One, purchasing a wig, and the other was accepting a ride from a stranger. Quote, I've got to be either the bravest or the dumbest girl alive because I've just accepted a ride from this guy. Hairpiece in tow, Diane watched the young woman say something to the man on the bike. She watched her climb onto the bike, and then the two were gone. Diane misidentified the motorcycle she saw as a Honda, but when detectives questioned a clerk from another store adjacent to the wig shop, that person said that the motorcycle they saw was a Triumph. Now, after hearing the description of the young man on the motorcycle, Officer Larry Mathewson had someone that fit the bill. John Norman Collins. You see, the two of these men were fraternity brothers in Theta Chi. Previously, John had been interviewed, and he was like, no. I was out of town, and I was at my mother's house all weekend. So remember that in the last episode, he's like, no, I wasn't around. I was out of town with my mom. And they believed him, right? They just walked away and were like, okay, you're good to go. Well, Larry himself had seen John riding his motorcycle around the Eastern Michigan University campus on that afternoon of July 23rd. When Mathewson questioned John on July 25th as to his whereabouts on the 23rd, John admitted that he had been riding his Triumph in the area and that he had stopped to chat with his former girlfriend. So Larry went to find this young lady, and when he did, he was given two recent pictures of John from that girlfriend. Pictures in hand, Larry took those to Diane at the wig shop and asked the two women working in the shop if these pictures looked like the man they saw on the motorcycle that day. With 100% certainty, they both exclaimed, yes, this is the guy. Police established that John loved motorcycles and that he had owned several of them, including a blue Triumph Bonneville. He held a part-time job as an inspector at a firm that manufactured drum brakes and was currently majoring in elementary education at Eastern Michigan University. Prior to enrolling at Eastern Michigan University in the fall of 1966, he had been an honor student and a football captain at his high school. As I mentioned in last week's episode, John was going into great detail at work, describing graphically the details and injuries that each of the murdered young ladies endured to women that he worked with. John would claim that it was his uncle Dave Leake. He's the one who told him about the gory details, as he was a sergeant on the local police force. But not every detail that John knew was publicly known. So how could he have known? When investigators spoke to David about this, he was quite clear in that he did not disclose any of those details to his nephew. Investigators also ascertained Collins had either been acquainted with most of the victims, had currently or previously lived close to them, or had possible prior contact with the victims just before the murders.
Wait a minute. So now with this last victim, now we start hearing that he was talking about previous victims with coworkers?
Yeah. Well, and that was also in part one. So that was also one of the things we talked about in part one, that he was kind of describing like these gory details to females that he worked with.
Oh, I don't remember that he was... Okay, so I don't understand. I mean, he was basically ratting himself out.
Yeah, but see, he's thinking he's the smartest dude in the room because his uncle is, on the force. So he's like, oh yeah, my uncle told me all about that. That's how I know. So he thinks he's that smart, that talking about all these details because my uncle told me about it.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just like, wait a minute. So he's even telling people about the murders as if in the third person.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. All right, so John lived across the street from Joan Schell, and we talked about that in the first episode, and where John worked in an office in Eastern, like on campus, Mary Felzar, his first victim, worked across the hall from him. When detectives interviewed the most recent girlfriend of John's, They learned that John would regularly visit her at her apartment complex, and this was directly across the road from the home of Dawn Bassam. In total, 7 witnesses would be found who would later testify to having seen John in the area between the university campus and the wig shop between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on July 23rd, including 3 young women who also said that John tried to get them to hop on his Triumph and go for a ride with him. So he was trying to get chicks on the back of his bike all day long, and then there is Karen. And she agreed, right? The one in the wig shop. So it worked. On Sunday, July 27th, police paid a visit to John at his apartment on Emmett Street. They wanted John to come down to the police station with them to take a polygraph test. And he was like, hell no, and refused to go anywhere or take the polygraph test because he was innocent. And basically, he didn't care who identified him. They were wrong. It wasn't him. So without enough evidence to arrest John, there was nothing they could do, and they left. Oddly enough, however, the next day, Arnold Davis, who was the roommate of John, saw him walk out of his bedroom carrying a box. So I've seen it labeled as a box or like a laundry basket, so it's interchangeable, so I'm just sticking with box, right? It was partially covered with a blanket. And as Arnold opened the door for John as he was walking out to leave the apartment with the box, he saw a few things that were in that box. A woman's purple shoe, material that looked like jeans all rolled up, some women's jewelry like earrings, and a burlap purse. John said that he just, decided to get rid of the box and everything that was in it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when Karen Beanman was killed, John was staying at his uncle's house, and that uncle was State Police Sergeant David Leake. David and his wife were on vacation during the time frame that Karen came up missing and then was found murdered. And they had returned home on July 29th, 3 days after the discovery of Karen's body. Yes, John had an apartment with a roommate, but he was staying at his uncle's because he was taking care of their German Shepherd while the family was out of town. John's Aunt Sandra straight away noticed several things as she was going through the house. Sandra had seen numerous paint marks covering the floor of the family basement, and that several items, including a bottle of ammonia, a box of laundry detergent, and a canister of black spray paint, were missing. Also, on the very day of their return home, Sergeant Link was notified by investigators that his nephew was a suspect and that they had some circumstantial evidence against him. Leake acknowledged that the evidence thus far gathered against his nephew was compelling. Although in the first interview, he did not advise officers of the items missing from his home or about the paint he and Sandra saw on the floor in the basement. Curiosity was now eating away at him, so Leake headed down into the basement and began scraping at the black paint. What he found under the paint to him looked like blood, and this is when he immediately headed to the police station to inform investigators of what he had done and what he thought he had found. Well, that's all they had to hear. A team was quickly put into place, and they all swarmed to Sergeant Leake's home, specifically the basement, for an intense forensic examination. What Sergeant Leake thought was blood was actually stains from varnish, but one of the investigators discovered something else. Numerous hair clippings, and guess what else? The majority of the hairs were less than 3/8 of an inch long next to the family washing machine. Does that sound familiar? Remember the panties that were stuffed into Karen's vagina when her body was found? There were lots of hair clippings that were at 3/8 of an inch long. When Sergeant Link was asked about the hair clippings, he told them that his wife Sandra would regularly cut their children's hair in the basement, and that she had done so shortly before the family had left for their vacation. Boom! Gotcha. But the hair clippings were not all that was seen in the basement. They had also found 9 areas of small spatterings of blood in the basement. When tested, that blood was human, and the blood type was type A. You want to take a guess at what Karen's blood type was, Christine?
I'm guessing type A.
Correct. With samples in hand, it was time for science to do its job. Were the hairs the same as what was found on Karen? A detailed forensic neutron analysis was performed on the hairs from the panties from Karen's body and the hairs recovered from Sergeant Leake's basement. They were an exact match. At this point, John can protest his innocence all he wants. Karen's body was in that basement. Did I say gotcha? Now, it's time to hone in on the neighbors of Sergeant Leake's. What, if anything, did they see the day Karen came up missing? One neighbor, Marjorie Barnes, recalled having seen John leaving his uncle's home with a deluxe laundry detergent box prior to the Leake family returning home from their vacation. Another neighbor informed investigators that she had heard muffled screams of a young female coming from the Leake residence on the evening Karen disappeared. It's time for investigators to visit John Collins yet again. But this time, I don't think he can refuse a trip to the police station. No, not this time, buddy. They told John about the paint and the varnish in the basement, and John immediately began to cry, but then quickly pulled his shit together, all the while continuing to deny that he even knew who Karen Sue Beanman was. Then John was told about the hair, the blood stains, and that the blood was type A, just like Karen's. No more bullshit from you, John. He was cuffed and arrested on the spot at his apartment. His apartment, bikes, and vehicles were searched top to bottom. I mean, holy crap. Can you imagine how his roomie Arnold was feeling at this point? What they did find were quite a few stolen items, of which Arnold told investigators that John and their former roommate had a nasty habit of committing burglaries. There was not any incriminating evidence found that could further connect John to Karen or any of the other murdered young ladies for that matter. But Arnold had something else to tell investigators. He told them that just 2 days prior to the search, that John had removed a box from his bedroom and told them what he had seen in it, that John had left in his car with it, and told them that John said he just decided to get rid of it. Must have had a feeling that he was about to get pinched. Too bad he got rid of those trinkets.
Well, did they end up finding the trinkets? And wait, you just brushed over how John and his roommate, the guy that they're talking to now, that John and his roommate were doing burglaries? Was that one of he was trying to excuse why they had things that he shouldn't have?
Right, so John actually had two roommates. So he had Arnold and he has another dude. So it's the other roommate that Arnold's telling the officers, hey, John and my other roommate, the two of them were burglarizing shit. Right. So also, if you remember in part one, remember I was talking about, how John loved his bikes and that he would steal whatever he needed to fix his bikes, and that John had also gotten kicked out of his fraternity because they're like, you're stealing shit. And he's like, no, it's not me. But he got kicked out. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, so he was like a petty crook, too. Mm-hmm. So not was he a mass murderer, but he was also sticky hands. He liked to steal things from people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay.
Yep. But to answer your question, no, they never found that box of trinkets. I don't know what the hell he did with that, but it's gone.
Well, that would have connected him to each murder, I'm sure.
Yeah, because remember, he liked to steal little things like their earrings and such. Clothes from the victims, pieces of clothes. Yeah.
Yeah, because of his klepto also on top of being a serial killer. So there's that.
Yep.
Great.
Yep. All right. So on August 1st, 1969, John Norman Collins was formally arraigned for the murder of Karen Sue Beanman. He was held without bond, and at a press conference, which was held on August 1st, regarding the arrest and charge of John Collins related to the murders, Police Superintendent Frederick Davis revealed that John had been a suspect in Karen's case from the moment Karen came up missing. But it was the forensic search in the basement, coupled with the report from Patrolman Larry Mathewson's report of the positive eyewitness identifications from the owner of the wig shop, along with her assistant, as well as the eyewitness from the other shop next to the wig shop, that allowed surveillance of John starting on July 26th. All of this led to a formal arrest and charge. In early August, investigators in Salinas, California, they contacted investigators here in Michigan and said that they had a reason to believe that a Michigan individual named John Collins may be responsible for the June 30th death of a 17-year-old girl named Roxy Ann Phillips. On August 3rd, 2 Washtenaw County detectives traveled to Salinas Police Department to review information and determine whether a connection existed between the Phillips murder and those which Collins was suspected of committing here in Michigan. Reviewing information regarding the murder of Roxy Ann Phillips, investigators discovered that immediately prior to her disappearance, Phillips had informed a close friend that she had become acquainted with an Eastern Michigan University student named John, who drove a silver gray Oldsmobile Cutlass and who was temporarily residing with a friend in a camper trailer. Upon tracing John's movements in relation to the dates of this woman's disappearance and murder of the 7 murder victims linked to the murders that had happened here in Michigan, investigators learned that on June 21st, John and his roommate, Andrew Manuel, so this is the other roomie, the one that used to be a burglar with John, the 2 of them traveled to Monterey, California in John's Oldsmobile Cutlass. Under aliases, the 2 men rented a camper and paid for it, along with their entire vacation, with stolen checks. When John came back to Michigan, John was alone. Andrew would later be found in Arizona. While in California and interviewing friends of Roxy's, investigators learned that she had been introduced to, quote, John from Michigan through a 17-year-old friend named Nancy Albrecht, who informed police she had become acquainted with John on June 29th as well, and that Roxy and John had gone on a date. Nancy described John as an Eastern Michigan University senior with aspirations to become a teacher. She gave a description of John, what he had on, and that he looked a lot like John Norman Collins. Nancy also said that John was supposed to meet her at her home on June 30th, but he never showed. Boy, is she lucky. Roxy's nude and badly beaten body was discovered in a ravine in Carmel Highlands on July 13th, 1969. The belt from her dress was knotted tightly around her neck. She had been strangled to death, and, like the girls murdered here in the Mitten, one of her earrings was missing. Along State Route 68, more of Roxy's personal items would be found. So, what about the campers the boys rented? It was found August 1st, 1969, in Monterey County, behind the home of Andrew Manuel's grandfather's home. A forensic examination of the trailer revealed it had been completely wiped clean. Not a single fingerprint could be found. Andrew's grandfather told investigators that his grandson and a young man by the name of John Collins was staying in the trailer for a minute, and that they had rented the camper from a place called Ypsilanti in June. He said that he thought both Andrew and John left it there after they took off to head back to Michigan. After the Michigan and California investigators shared their findings, they agreed that there was a connection between Roxy's murder and the murders here in Michigan. On August 5th, 1968, it was formally announced to the public. An FBI arrest warrant was issued against Andrew Manuel, who was in Phoenix on August 6th and detained by FBI agents. Manuel was extensively questioned as to his potential involvement in both Roxy's murder and those committed in Michigan, which investigators had linked to John. Andrew took a polygraph test, which he passed. On December 18th, it was publicly announced that Andrew had no knowledge of the murders, so he was just down for the burglaries.
Are we sure? Is that really how it pans out? Because I was just thinking, everything that he did with the moving of the bodies afterwards, are we sure that the friend didn't have anything to do with it?
There's no evidence that he was involved in anything. Now, I do remember, and because I remember in the part 1, remember the one girl who her roommate went with her to the bus station because she was going to catch a bus to get to her boyfriend, right? Remember that? And then her friend, and I can't remember the name right offhand right now, but she's like, oops, I missed the bus. I'm just going to thumb it. And there was a car that pulled up and it had a couple guys in it. And I was wondering, well, why would he have someone else in that car with him? Who could that possibly be? And so then once, I get to this part, I'm like, oh, it must have been this other roommate. Or maybe he had both of his roommates in there. Because I think she even said there were 3 guys in the car. She was asked if she wanted rides. She's like, yes. Her roommate's like, don't do it. And she's like, nope, I'm doing it. The next thing you know, she comes up missing. So did they all hang out? And then, John Boogie's on off with this girl, drops off the roomies. I don't know. I find it odd.
Yeah. And at bare minimum, the roomies know that he's been with these girls that turn up murdered. So at bare minimum, they knew what he was doing.
I think so too. But nothing ever happens to these guys. Yeah.
They got away with it. Because they had something to do with it.
I'm thinking so too. And
act if no other crimes were committed, failure to act and failure to come forward.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember about John is we know he has a hairpin trigger, anger problem. And in one of the interviews I was watching of the police that were involved, like the one guy was talking about, when he was interrogating John, that this man, it was like, if he said something that would trigger him, it wasn't like John was getting mad. He was like, bam, instant anger, like boom, that fast. There's no build up. So who knows? Maybe his roommates were scared as hell because John's crazy. Maybe that's how he got him to stay quiet. You know what I mean?
Making them victims, making me feel bad for them too. Ugh.
Yep. See how I did that? Okay. Now, a formal indictment would later be served for John for the first-degree murder of Roxy Ann Phillips in April of 1970, although the evidence surrounding this indictment was ordered to be sealed until after John's murder trial of Karen Sue Beanman had ended. During the pretrial on August 14th, 1969, John sat through hours of testimony from 9 witnesses for the prosecution. Judge Edward Deek ruled that probable cause had been established, and John was formally ordered to stand trial for Karen's murder. At a second hearing in September, John refused to enter a plea, so Judge John Conlon ordered a plea of not guilty entered on his behalf, and I didn't know they could do that. But again, at this time, it's 1970, so maybe they could. At this hearing, John's court-appointed attorney, Richard Ryan, challenged the validity of the physical evidence and the credibility of the circumstantial evidence before formally requesting that this case against his client be dismissed and the evidence seized from his apartment and vehicle to be thrown out on the grounds that John had not consented to a search of his property and as investigators did not present a warrant. His attorney was also trying to get the trial location moved away from the Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti area because of all the publicity the arrest had stirred up. Judge Conlon denied defense motions to dismiss the case or suppress any evidence obtained, ruling John Collins' arrest had been on reasonable grounds. John's attorney was able to get John to take a private and independent polygraph test. The prosecution agreed to this as well, and that the test would be off the record, and the results of the test would also remain confidential. So what's the fucking point? Right? What's the point? All right, so...
The point for them to know and for them to be able to even get more evidence on him. Okay. It's like, oh, just tell us, it'll be a secret. But then whatever you tell us, we're going to go dig up and use against you as best we can.
I guess. All right, so 3 weeks after the polygraph, at a meeting with Judge Conlon, John's mother and John's defense attorney summarized the results of the exam and suggested, quote, a diminished capacity plea for an insanity defense. Mrs. Collins, incensed at the implication, immediately dismissed Ryan from the case. Neil Fink and Joseph Louisel, partners at one of Detroit's highest-priced law firms, agreed to take over as John's defense team. In order to pay for her son's hefty retainer and attorney's fees, John's mother remortgaged her home. With the new defense attorney secured, a trial date was ordered. The trial of John Norman Collins for the murder of Karen Sue Beanman began in the Washtenaw County Court Building on June 2nd, 1970. He was tried in Ann Arbor before Judge John Conlon. Initial jury selection began and would continue until July 9th. John's defense attorneys tried several times throughout the jury selection process to move the trial to a jurisdiction outside of Washtenaw County, but all attempts were rejected by the judge, who ruled on June 29th that the 14 members of the jury selected from Ann Arbor would serve as jurors throughout the trial. John would not be testifying in his own defense, and I don't think we're surprised about that. The prosecution was only charging John with the murder of Karen Sue Beanman, with the state contending that she had been murdered by John in the basement of the Leak residence. I mean, really, this is the only charge of murder they can pin on him, as the other murders didn't have any solid evidence that tied John to them, which is sad because they all had the same M.O. The prosecution began opening statements on July 20th, 1970. They would be presenting evidence that showed John Collins had been with Karen Sue Beanman at the time she was last seen alive by Mrs. Joan Ghosh and her assistant from the wig shop, that John had taken Karen to his uncle's home, where in the basement he had tortured, beat, and strangled her to death, that John had also removed Karen's body from his uncle's home and dumped her body. He also attempted to persuade his roommate to give him a false alibi. The jury was told that they would hear eyewitness accounts during their testimonies, as well as the more than 500 hair samples found on Karen's panties, which matched the hair clippings later recovered from the basement of John's uncle. The prosecution said they will also prove that John had total access to his uncle's home and the basement the day Karen disappeared. They would also prove that John tried to clean up the crime scene and remove evidence, and that blood samples were recovered from the basement that matched Karen's blood type. As the prosecution wrapped up their opening statement, they requested that the jury return a guilty verdict of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When it was time for the defense to address the jury with their opening statement, they concurred that the murder of Karen Beanman was, quote,
a vicious, sadistic attack,
and that her badly decomposed body was almost beyond human comprehension. They said at best the prosecution had a weak case at proving John murdered Karen. They also said the eyewitness that ID'd John as the man on the motorcycle could not be reliable, and they intended to present several witnesses who could provide an alibi for John on the day Karen was abducted and murdered. The defense also said that the individuals that provided an alibi for John were harassed by police, and furthermore stated that the tests on the hair samples found on Karen's underwear were not reliable, and that John's uncle, Sergeant David Leake, refused to give the blood type of his family to them. July 20th, 1970, began the witness testimonies. The first two witnesses to testify were Karen's two roommates. Each detailed Karen's character, as well as what she did and where she went the day she never returned home. After the roommates were dismissed from the stand, the person who had found her body on July 26, 1969, was sworn in and also testified. Once that person was dismissed, up next was the medical examiner that was at the crime scene, and his name was Dr. Craig Barlow. He testified that although Karen had been deceased for almost 72 hours, her body had only been in the location where she was found for approximately 24 hours before being discovered. Again, sounds like the same MO as all the other bodies that had been murdered and moved. The following day, Washtenaw County Sheriff Douglas Harvey testified as to the discovery of Karen's body, her autopsy, and his obtaining an updated composite drawing of the suspect from whom Karen had last been seen alive with from Mrs. Joan Ghosh and her assistant, Patricia Spaulding, from the wig shop. Both women had agreed this composite drawing was accurate and only disagreed as to the structure of the suspect's chin. Joan Ghosh, the wig store owner, when shown a photograph of John Collins, identified him as the man she had seen that day on the motorcycle with Karen. To expand on their allegations that certain defense witnesses had been subjected to police harassment and that eyewitness accounts had been flawed, defense attorney Joseph Louiselle subjected Sheriff Harvey to a 45-minute cross-examination as to his contact with the two eyewitnesses prior to completion of the composite drawing. In cross-examination, Sheriff Harvey admitted to driving Mrs. Ghosh and her assistant to East Lansing to view the updated composite drawing of the suspect in Karen's murder. He had also shown photographs of various other suspects, as well as John Collins, to Ghosh prior to her formally identifying John in the photo lineup. 3 days into the trial, Joan Ghosh, the wig shop owner, was called to the stand. She explained that on the day of Karen's disappearance, Karen told her while buying her hairpiece that she had accepted a ride home from the man waiting outside the wig shop on his motorcycle. When she was asked by the prosecution to formally identify the individual who was waiting outside the wig shop on his motorcycle, she pointed to John Norman Collins. After Joan, her assistant Patricia Spaulding took the stand. She testified that she saw John Collins outside the shop on his motorcycle as well, waiting for Karen. Although subject to intense cross-examination by defense attorney Neil Fink as to the credibility of her testimony, Ghosh remained insistent in her identification of John Norman Collins as being the individual who had waited for Karen. On July 27th, Arnold Davis, one of John's roommates, testified to being in the company of John throughout that whole late afternoon and evening of July 23rd, 1969, and this is hours after Karen had last been seen alive. Judge Conlon allowed Arnold's testimony that John removed a laundry box containing women's clothing and jewelry from the apartment, and that John put it in his car 2 days prior to his arrest. He was not allowed to be asked about any of the items that he saw in that box, only the items that belonged to Karen. Smart move on the defense so that, he couldn't be tied to the other murders, huh?
Well, true, but at the same time, really does it matter? Because in Michigan, he's going to do life without parole anyway for 1 murder or 7 murders or 10 murders, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I mean, so, on one hand, I get it, but on the other hand, it's sad that the families of all those other victims don't get any closure.
Right.
That they were also included in his arrest.
Yeah, because, it's the same MO. It's this guy. It's just not formally, attached to him.
I might wonder, I know this is getting off topic a little bit, but that makes me wonder, when a serial killer goes down for 1 murder, then all of those other murders are technically considered open cases forever.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. They are open because there's not a statute of limitations on murder, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And if they never connect him, but he's the one, and he's just rotting in jail,
mm-hmm.
nothing ever comes of that. Anyway, that's unfortunate, but...
Yeah, it is sad.
At least they can tell themselves that he's rotting in jail, as he deserves.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Sandra Leake, John's aunt, she testified the key to their home was given to John so he could feed the family's German Shepherd. She also confirmed she cut her children's hair in the basement like she always did just before they left on vacation, and that when they returned home, that she had noticed several items from her basement had been removed. She had found a wet, soiled cloth containing hair next to the laundry tub, and that the other items, including a bottle of ammonia, were also missing. Sergeant Kennard Christensen, who was head of the State Police Crime Lab, he testified regarding the results of the forensic test conducted in the Leake family basement, and that test confirmed evidence of blood in different areas in the basement. He also said there were partial fingerprints found in the basement, but those did not belong to anyone in the Leake family. 2 forensic witnesses were also called to testify related to physical evidence which indicated Karen had been killed in the Leake residence. The first witness to testify was the head of the Michigan Health Department's Crime Detective Laboratory, and his name was Walter Holes. He testified as to the human hair clippings found inside Karen Sue Beanman's panties were an exact match to those recovered from the basement of Sergeant David Leake. When the defense cross-examined him, Holes stood firm. The color, length, type, and diameter of the hair samples found on Karen's panties were a precise match to those found in the Leake family basement. Immediately following the testimony of Walter Holes, a colleague of his named Curtis Fluker testified that the blood type of the tissue samples recovered from the Leake family basement matched that of Karen Sue Beanman. The 47th and final witness to appear for the prosecution was a University of California chemistry professor named David Vincent P. Gwynn. He concluded that the hair samples from Karen's panties bore, quote, a remarkable similarity to those recovered from the lake basement. 5 independent witnesses were called to testify on behalf of the defense to lay a time frame that could be an alibi for John. All of these witnesses were employees of a motorcycle dealer, which John had visited the day of the murder. They had all remembered John walking into the dealership that day, but they were not all totally solid on what time that was. But all agreed that John came in when they had been eating lunch, so that would have been between the hours of 1 and 2 p.m. Then that time changed from 12 to 2 p.m. One of these witnesses said they had been repeatedly harassed by an Ann Arbor sergeant as to the actual time he saw Collins. Well, yeah, man, I can see that. Give me a freaking time, right? Be solid on the time. The defense also brought a neutron analyst to the stand to attempt to discredit the previous forensic experts for the prosecution related to the hairs that were found. This expert said he didn't think the previous experts had sufficient chemical samples from the lake basement to test. He also said that they had insufficient data because in order to have a conclusive neutron analysis, at least 10 components in a shaft, like a hair shaft sample, must be compared, whereas the team who performed the analysis only had 5 components. Another director of forensic research testified that the hair samples retrieved from Karen's panties were, quote, of a different origin than the hair samples retrieved from the lake basement. He said the likelihood of her undergarments accumulating these hairs from a basement was extremely remote. In rebuttal to the testimony of this expert, the defense recalled Dr. Walter Holes to testify as to the samples he had himself taken for identification. Dr. Holes affirmed that he had taken 20 magnified photographic slides of samples retrieved from Karen's panties to the lab for analysis, and that they had contained numerous man-made fibrous materials, not just the one that defense said were on her panties. On August 13th, both the prosecution and defense attorneys delivered their closing arguments to the jury. This lasted for 2 days. Before the jury was dismissed for deliberation, the judge told them they have a decision to make, and these are their 2 options. 1, guilty of first-degree murder, or 2, not guilty. It took 3.5 days before the jury came to a verdict. On August 19th, 1970, John Norman Collins was unanimously found guilty of the first-degree murder of Karen Sue Beanman. But not a single reaction from John. Gasps were heard in the galley, and John's mother and sister walked out of the courtroom in tears. On August 28th, 1970, this was the scheduled sentencing hearing for John. Prior to sentencing, the judge asked John if he wished to address the court. Well, he did. John stood up and said, quote,
I have 2 things to say. I think they, the jury, conscientiously tried to give me a fair trial. The jury did not take its task lightly, but I think things were blown out of proportion. The circumstances surrounding this case prevented me from getting a fair trial. It was a travesty of justice that took place in this courtroom. I hope someday it will be corrected. Second, I never knew a girl named Karen Sue Beanman. I never had a conversation with her. I never took her to a wig shop. I never took her to my uncle's home. I never took her life.
The judge sentenced John to serve a term of life imprisonment with hard labor in solitary confinement at Southern Michigan Prison. Of course, immediately the defense announced that they will be appealing on the grounds of, quote, tainted identification and the change of venue question. The first motion by Collins' attorneys contending denial of defense motion to move the trial outside of Washtenaw County and the prejudice of prosecution witnesses were filed with the Michigan Court of Appeals on December 14th, 1970. The first appeal was formally rejected on October 24th, 1972. Wow, That took almost 2 years. Between 1972 and 1976, John appealed his murder conviction on 4 different occasions, citing contentions that the Michigan murders had received extensive media publicity in Washtenaw County, and that 5 separate motions for change of venue had been submitted by the defense counsel, 2 of which had been filed throughout the actual jury selection process. If you remember that, we talked about that. Upon the grounds of pretrial publicity minimizing any chance of obtaining an unbiased jury in Washtenaw County. Each motion filed had been reserved or, in the final instance, denied. In each and every appeal, John's conviction was upheld, with successive appellate judges of the Supreme Court announcing in October 1974 their refusal to review his conviction, and the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit Court announcing their own satisfaction with the earlier findings of the district court. Each ruling stated no evidence existed to suggest extensive publicity had interfered with pretrial or trial proceedings, and that police had not broken any protocol in showing 2 eyewitnesses photographs of Collins prior to his arrest and their being asked to identify him in a police lineup. So, are you left wondering, well, what about Roxy? When John was handed down his conviction in 1970, a grand jury indictment against John remained outstanding in relation to the June 1969 murder of Roxy Ann Phillips in Monterey County, California. The physical and circumstantial evidence linking Collins to this particular murder was stronger than any of the other 6 outstanding murders that were linked to him in Michigan. And authorities in Monterey did file several motions to extradite Collins to California to stand for trial for the murder of Roxy in 1970 and 1971. These motions were repeatedly contested by Collins' attorneys. Neil Fink, who opposed and successfully delayed his client's extradition upon the grounds of due process. The state of California postponed their request to extradite Collins to face charges relating to Phillips' murder in June of 1971, citing Collins' then ongoing appeals against his convictions in the state of Michigan as the cause, and their likely resubmittal should any of his Michigan appeals be successful. Just 6 months later, in January of 1972, Monterey County District Attorney William Curtis formally announced via a spokesman the intention of California authorities to waive all extradition proceedings against Collins for Phillips' murder. This spokesman indicated the reasoning being that, as John had already received a life sentence in Michigan, the case therefore was undeserving of, quote, priority attention by California authorities, in part due to the fact that Collins would be returned to Michigan to serve his sentence if convicted. At the time of the announcement of the decision, preliminary legal maneuvers between Michigan and California authorities had been ongoing to extradite Collins to Monterey to face trial for Phillips' murder. Although John was never tried for the murders of the other young women, physical and circumstantial evidence exists in each case indicating that John had committed these murders. Now that we all know what a horrible, diabolical, evil man this man was, let's put him on the shelf and never speak of him again. He is currently still kicking it at 77 years old at G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility in Jackson, Michigan. Now, he was just 22 years old when he committed his first murder in 1967. And as of this year, he will be celebrating his 54th year in the slammer. So we don't want to talk about John Collins anymore, but we here at Malice, we prefer to remember the names of his innocent young victims. And they are Mary Therese Felser. She was 19 and she was murdered by John July 9th, 1967. Then Joan Elspeth Schell. She was 20 on June 30th, 1968. Marilyn Skelton, just 16 years old, when she was murdered March 24th, 1969. Dawn Louise Bassam, 13 years old, April 15th, 1969. Alice Elizabeth Colomb, 21 years old, June 8th, 1969. Roxy Ann Phillips, 17 years old, June 30th, 1969, and she was the one murdered in California. And the last victim was Karen Sue Beanman, 18 years old, on July 23rd, 1969.
But before we get off this bastard, let me just say how unfair it is for some murder victims' families that when their child is unfortunately murdered, in cases like this, they just get lumped in like that and never really receive their justice in a weird way. And they don't really get the closure of a trial. Thankfully, I don't know this firsthand, how it actually feels. But you can debate it either way. Like, you want to see the trial to have the closure, or you just want to know that they're rotten in jail. But there's never any definitive conclusion to any of it when you're one of the families that are just lumped in underneath like that. It's sad. It's just sad. I mean, yes, of course it's sad that they're gone and that they died in such a horrible way. It's traumatizingly sad. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know. It feels like there's no closure. There's no justice for them in a weird way.
Right. I agree. I mean, and to be honest, isn't it funny? John gets locked up and there's no more murders? No more murders following the MO, at least, right?
Yeah.
So who else could it have been?
I still think that there's some that he got away with. There's some that happened that nobody ever pinned on him and nobody ever made the connection. I'm always going to have that haunting feeling like, what about the ones that we don't know about?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And what are those families doing to try and get justice for themselves?
Yeah, and I'd also like to know what kicked this off in him. You know, he was walking the walk, talking the talk.
Yeah, that's what I alluded to in the synopsis when we were doing the recap. I think that there was probably many more horrific things that he did. I think that there's many more horrific things that he did. Like, you know, he probably tortured animals in the woods. All of those things that make a serial killer that nobody knows about because they happen in all of the things that we never really know about unless the serial killers tell us themselves, you know?
Right. And in part one, he did tell one of his friends that was a girl or a former girlfriend, whatever. He did tell her that he had killed, I think it was a dog or a cat. I think it was a dog, that he strangled it. So, you know, maybe that's what he was doing all along. Maybe in junior high and in high school, maybe that's what he was doing, is just killing animals, practicing his brutality before finally in college he just thought, I'm moving on to a human.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy how they kind of all, serial killers they all follow that same psychotic path, you know, of graduated torture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't think I'm ever gonna. I mean, I don't like all this, you know, mayhem and malice like you do, and all of our listeners do, because they're like, oh yeah, crime story. Let me hear about it. I'm not that way. I'm a bleeding heart, but at the same time, I get to feel very vengeful. Like, I want them to really pay for what they did. And I don't know if life in prison really fits the bill. I don't know. It leaves you feeling all sorts of feelings when you hear stories like this.
Yeah, and I'd like to know what kind of hard labor he was subjected to, right? Because that was in the order when he was sentenced. Life imprisonment, hard labor, and confinement. And
well, actually, that's a hot topic right now. I was just actually having this conversation with somebody about how they had passed a law in California. And basically, it's a slavery law, kind of, that was on the books. And they kept it going. Because when we hear the word slavery, we think, oh, God, no, that's wrong on all accounts. You never want to enslave a human being to do work for nothing, you know, as the egregious things that we've done in the past in America and other countries as well have done it. Slavery was abolished, so we thought. But technically, in prison systems, like the chain gang that we're all familiar with, that is enslavement. And I had a conversation, and we were debating whether or not that was good. And a lot of people are blowing it up right now that slavery is bad, and how did California do this, and how is this allowable in today's society, and blah, blah, blah. But then I was like, but hey, they're in prison. You know what I mean? And we want them to pay for their crimes. So why not enslave them? I know this is horrible. I can't really talk to all this. So please, everybody, don't come after me like I know what the hell I'm talking about, because I don't completely. This is a novice, and I am not a legal in any way, shape, or form. Let me just put that disclaimer out there. However, like, just thinking through it, like, what else could they or should they be doing in prison to pay for their crime, to pay back society, but to build roadways, clean roadways, and things of that nature? But then the argument for that is enslavement. Like, where's the line? How do you make those differentials? You know?
Well,
I don't know.
Well,
I don't.
Here's.
That's all I got.
I'm actually for it. Make them be miserable. Make them work hard. This is not supposed to be a joyride. It's not just 3 hots and a cot and you go work the fuck out and build up your muscles. You know? Go sew some pants. Go break some rocks.
I agree with you on that. But then, what about the people that are wrongfully convicted?
Well, there's
then again, we got to trust and believe in the legal system, which we all know is fallible. So I don't know. I don't know where I land on that.
Mm-hmm.
I know that slavery is bad. I also think that incarceration should definitely come with some hard labor to pay back society, to do something for the betterment of society.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of enslavement. I don't know. Catch-22?
Catch-22. Oh, by the way, and that's the book that John Norman Collins left on one of his victims. How about that? Round Robin.
What do you mean? Catch-22?
There's a book, Catch-22, that he had left either right next to or right on the body of one of his victims.
Oh my God. So now before we do the round robin on this episode, I'm going to have to find out what that book Catch-22 is about.
I know, me too. Damn it.
How ironic is that?
I know. Now I have to read extra. I'm mad.
What the hell?
All right. I know. This is a crazy story. Oh, and P.S. He is imprisoned in Jackson, which is about 45 minutes from me. And so that's a little unnerving to think that this bastard is that close to where I am. I don't like it.
Yeah, well, the unreal thing is prisons everywhere have people in there that would make people shudder.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, most of the prisoners in prison are there for not as gruesome of crime as this. These are the gruesome of the most gruesome.
Yeah, so I commend the judge who gave him...
No. Who's living in those penitentiaries? Yeah,
we don't want to know. So good on Judge for, handing him the life sentence, but also for handing him hard labor and confinement. Good on you, Judge. All right. Well, that was a hefty story, and I'm so glad we're done with it because, it's been everything that this guy's done has been dancing around in my head for a couple weeks, and it's been rough. I think he's the most brutal that we've come across yet. Hopefully there's not worse ones out there, but hey, you never know what we're going to come across in the mitten, right?
Unfortunately, but fortunately for us, there's a lot of malice in the mitten, so we keep talking about it.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll uncover someone worse. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for coming back and listening. Again, it means the world to us, so thank you. Have a great week, and we will see you back on Wednesday for Round Robin. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.
Bye.